So I know that's not maybe the most direct answer to the question, and I can get more into, and I will, I'll get into more specific.
I think it was really helpful because I feel like next time somebody around here asks me why they have to learn this, I'm just going to tell them because you will be a more interesting roommate at the re-education camps.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think
Perfect. I
that
love
might
it.
really be helpful. So welcome to Scalay Sisters, where we are cultivating the maximum number of thinking moms we can. This is the podcast for classical homeschooling mamas who yearn for something more than just checking boxes and getting it all done. Scalay Sisters discusses topics that matter to those of us who believe that educating ourselves through reading widely, thinking deeply, and applying faithfully equips us for the task of educating our children. I'm your host, Brandy Wenzel. To get my free, almost weekly, mostly Charlotte Mason newsletter, go to afterthoughtsblog.net/subscribe and sign up. My co-host today is Misty Winkler. Misty is a homeschooling mom of 5, including 2 graduates. She writes and podcasts at simplyconvivial.com and is the author of 2 excellent books, The Convivial Homeschool and Simplified Organization. Our guest today is Andy Patton. Andy Patton has held various roles in healthcare technology and venture capital. As an entrepreneur in the healthcare space, he built and successfully exited his first company. He has also started and currently owns a company in the construction industry. Before going into business, Mr. Patton spent his early career as a high school teacher of Latin, Greek, music, and math. Mr. Patton joined New College Franklin as president of the school in 2023. Prior to that, he served for 9 years on the board of directors, including the last 5 years as chairman of the board. He has taught courses on Dante as well as economics. We are pleased to announce that registration for our annual spring training sessions is now open. Our coach this year is Andrew Zwerneman from Cana Academy. Andrew is going to teach 2 sessions on history as a classical subject. The first session will help us get away from Marxism and adopt a classical view of history. The second session will offer us a method for teaching history. It's going to be so great. To register, just go to scolaysisters.com/history to sign up. That's scolaysisters.com/history. In today's episode, Misty and I discuss classical college education with Andy Patton. Is there a difference between a classical college and a classics major at a regular college? Can the classically educated get jobs after they graduate? You're going to love this conversation. And so, without further ado, let's get to it. Let's start off with our School A every day. Misty, why don't you go first and show us how it's done?
All right. Well, I am almost done with Brothers Karamazov for the 3rd time in 5 years. So if people have felt like, I thought she mentioned this already as a School A every day, I have. And I never expected to be reading it this often. But
I think a good question is why?
Why? Well, this time I'm reading it because my local book group is reading it. I thought about just going because I last read it like 2.5, 3 years ago. And I thought, well, it's kind of recentish enough. If I read a synopsis, I could participate in the conversation. But the first time I read it, I listened to it on audio and I got to the ending and I said, I totally do not understand how that ending connected to the whole story at all. What just happened? I thought that I missed something while listening. I totally spaced out and missed something. And then I read the paperback version, actually read the words on the paper about 2.5 years ago. I'm like, nope, I didn't miss anything. This is just a lot of interesting connections that must be there, but I don't see them. And my paperback is still packed. So I'm back at the audio version for this local book club reading. I don't know, the 3rd time might be the charm. I'm noticing the connections in a way that I didn't the other times. And
interesting.
They make a big deal about the Karamazovs being Karamazov, almost like it's an adjective that describes it. It's like, wait a second. Every character is actually like that. I'm seeing a lot that's going on and even feeling, in a lot of uncomfortable ways. Like, I don't know, I'm kind of like that sometimes too. I know that this isn't the right thing to do, but I'm just going to let fly and see what happens.
What could go wrong?
What could go wrong? I'm just going to, give into my passion here or there. It's what could go wrong?
I don't recommend that as a life philosophy, Misty.
No. So yeah, when you just see something writ large, you're like, oh, even my little small ways are just like that, and so you see it like exaggerated and you're like, oh yeah, that is bad, isn't it? So I don't know. I'm enjoying it this time more than I did the first two times and seeing a lot more connections. So that just proves it's literature.
True.
So what are you going to do if it doesn't click on the third time?
It's a good question. I am getting a little bit. I think I have 3 hours left on the audiobook. I'm coming up to the part that I knew I got confused last time. So I am still a little bit nervous. Like, what if I don't get it? What if I don't get it? What if it doesn't come together? But I know it's not going to come together the way I would like it to come together. And that's a big part of the discomfort too. So
it's that you weren't the writer.
I'm kind of ready for that. Well, it's a Russian novel. It's not going to all resolve where then if there's redemption in a clean way,
right.
It's like, so anyway, it's going to be redemption in an uncomfortable way. So
interesting. Well, Andy, how about you? What have you been reading?
Well, I've been reading a number of things. So I also lead in addition to being president at New College, I lead my senior in high school as CC group, reading all the CC things. And I was going to talk about the Aeneid, but I think actually I'm going to talk about De Imitatione Christi of the Imitation of Christ by Thomas à Kempis. So I'm reading that for the second time right now and reading it in Latin, which is a lot of fun.
Oh, wow.
Fairly easy Latin. It is just, it was so encouraging to me the first time around. And again, second time around, I found it to just be so rich and nurturing to my soul, both encouraging way and then in a convicting way as well. Yeah, so that's what I've been going through again. And it'll probably have some bearing on our conversation later on, but he's very big on the importance of love for and obedience to Christ, and those being the principal things, and the vanity of excessive learning and philosophizing, and the emptiness of grasping to earthly things. One of the things that I just read, I think it's book 1, chapter 21 or so, he's describing man in his current state as being pretty much in a state of misery with how bad the world is and how corrupt we are. But it's just interesting how different it is from the way that we think about the world in our therapeutic age. Much of what he describes man as properly like is, things that get him diagnosed with depressive disorder today. And he's you're actually disordered if you don't see this, if you don't understand the difficulty and hardship of the world. He says, woe to those who know not their own misery, and greater woe to those who love this miserable and corrupt life. And, we say, no, that means there's something wrong and we've got a pill for that.
So true.
Anyway, that's what I'm reading right now.
Well, I feel like I've been put to shame again.
It's okay. You get a pass. You moved across the country.
That's true. That's true. I'm just doing a little bit easier reading than some people here. So the book this is my reading while I'm working on my cross-stitch tapestry. So I feel a little bit more highbrow if I add that part. But I'm listening to Michael Crichton's Andromeda Strain, which I don't know. Do either one of you read sci-fi?
He wrote Jurassic Park, right?
Yes, he did.
I read that like in high school.
He did. This is definitely an older book. Like this harkens back to the era of, putting a man on the moon or something. It's definitely not that high-tech genetic engineering. And yet there is a common theme. I was thinking about this. So the book starts off and there's this scientist or something, but he's basically making the argument that if you just think of the situation of whether or not there's extraterrestrial life in the sense of probabilities, and you look at Earth as a model of those probabilities, then you would see that, whereas the apex predator man, right, there's only one species of man, he says. And then there's, 4 species of primates. And then you go down and down. When you get down to things like bacteria and viruses and parasites, these small-celled or one-celled creatures, there's just thousands of different species. Then he predicts that actually the first encounter with extraterrestrial life would be an encounter with a small one-celled organism like a bacteria. It wouldn't be with a complex creature, just if you're working in probabilities. Then from there, the part that I'm at right now is that so there's been the Andromeda Strain is what they're calling this emergency where something is brought back from, I believe it's a meteor, and it's deadly to mankind, or at least appears to be. But in the middle of this, you find out that it's not really an accident. I mean, it is an accident. It's an accident in that it happened in the way that it happened. But it's not really an accident because the government had decided to send out these space capsule things to try to find bacteria on meteorites and things so that they would have a one-up on basically bioterrorism. And so I was kind of like, oh, so we've always done this sort of thing where we don't think about what we're doing and try to weaponize creation and just find out how that goes. It's interesting because by the time Crichton writes Jurassic Park, he's gotten really preachy. And so there's these long speeches about how it can be profound. It's profound in the movie version for sure, because they cut it down in length. But you get this sense of like, well, why just because you can do something doesn't mean you should, right? So there's this pointing out of the difference between ethics and what you actually are capable of doing. And then how do you find limits? Where do you get your limits for your behavior when you can do something that is maybe never been done before? But here he's just kind of telling the story, not commenting on the ethics of what the government has been doing, other than to say that they've been hiding it from the scientists that were involved. So the scientists thought they're doing this just exploration, not knowing that in the meanwhile, the military is ready to jump on it and weaponize it. Anyway, I'm not sure which way it's going to go. Maybe he'll start preaching at us by the end. But I did have a friend who took a literature class, like a modern literature class, that talked about Crichton as being only capable of preaching, kind of in a negative sort of way. And I just thought, well, so far, it looks to me like his earlier work was not that way. I don't know. Maybe people didn't catch it in his earlier work. So by the time he got to the end, he's like trying to pound it
Make
home.
it more obvious.
Just because you can doesn't mean you should. Let's all say it like a mantra. So anyway, so that was my book. It's actually quite good.
I have a memory of watching that movie with my dad when I was, I don't know, 10, 11, 12, something.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it's one of these typical, it's either 70s or maybe late 60s, but I think it's 70s. Everything's very dark. Anyway, I don't remember much about it, just that it was weird.
I didn't even know there was a movie, so now I'll have to look it up when I'm done.
Mm-hmm.
I can see why his books get made into movies. I feel like they move in the right way to easily lend itself to the film genre. But I prefer the reading, I think, overall. Jurassic Park's a little gory, so maybe that kind of crippled me.
Hi, Abby here to invite you to join us in Sistership. It is the place for homeschooling moms to talk about all things homeschool, educational philosophy, books, and how to avoid burnout. Sistership is private and free from ads, free from drama, and free to join. We wanted a place, no matter where we live, to find thinking mothers to discuss ideas, to become equipped and confident, and to not take ourselves too seriously. Sistership will encourage you to read widely, think deeply, and apply faithfully all that you are learning. So, join us for the camaraderie and stay for the fun.
We have invited you here today, Andy, because we see a pattern in, I'd say, the general homeschool community, but we think it's now bleeding over. And by we, I mainly mean me. Misty, I don't know if maybe you do agree with me. Anyway, I think it's bleeding over into the classical homeschooling community now. I'm starting to see this type of talk when I either encounter people in real life or even online, but I would call it basically a utilitarian view of college. And the central question becomes, will they be able to provide for a family? And that's brought up a lot in regard to college in general. And then even more so if we're talking about going to a classical college or going to maybe a bigger university, but majoring in something more obscure like Latin or liberal arts or whatever. And I mean, I do think parents are right to be disenchanted with just college culture on average in our country. So they see kids going to school. I know I've seen this with kids of my friends. They go to school, they cast off their religion, they cast off their morality, they graduate with crippling debt. And I'm hearing a lot, especially of the younger generation of moms in homeschooling, starting to say things like, well, college isn't for everyone. And then they're talking about things like apprenticeships or entrepreneurship or tech school. And I completely agree college isn't for everyone. And I know Misty does too, because I know at least one of her kids so far has not chosen to go to college, at least not right out of school. But I think in the middle of this, it seems to me like it's even possible the classical homeschool community could be losing a vision for a classical college, what it's for, what it can do, why we might want or need to have a certain percentage of Christians who, develop their intellectual lives in the context of a college. That's kind of the context for why we invited you here today. So with all that said, I feel like we should just start with that big question that we hear over and over again, which is, can someone with a degree from a liberal arts college lead a normal life, get a real job, provide for a family? Because that seems to be the big objection that I'm hearing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a really good question. And like you, I sympathize with the reaction generally that college is not for everyone. And I think that we have, as a society, really gotten the direction of causality backwards when we started to talk about why college is for everyone. Namely, we looked at, the average salaries of people that were coming out of college and said, college grads make more. Therefore, let's get everybody into college. And the direction of causality was totally backwards. There was, huge self-selection bias going on there. People that go to college tended to make more money because the sorts of people that chose to go to college were the sorts of people that were driven and, likely to do that anyway.
Right.
Then we introduced, a whole slew of folks that probably should never have gone to college and probably would not have opted to go to college without the market distortions of a bunch of federal funds pouring into it and making it artificially cheap.
Mm-hmm.
And that, I think, has led really predictably to the situation we're in now, where, you've got a bunch of people with crippling debt and not really marketable skills. And even the pedigree of some of the top universities is starting to lose its sheen a little bit on resumes. But to the question of whether or not someone with a liberal arts degree can get a real job and provide for a family, I think the answer is certainly yes, but I do think that the first part of my answer there is really important to keep in mind. So while I think that they can, I think one question for sure is, should they? And should we, first of all, let's take that basic assumption about everyone going to college and let's, take it out to the wood chipper where it belongs. And then let's think about what a liberal arts degree is supposed to provide, or what education should have been in the first place. So let's differentiate here real quick between just a liberal arts degree, generally speaking, and maybe what we're doing at New College. You have your New England liberal arts colleges dotting the coast.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really not what we're talking about here. Those are basically undifferentiated from your large state schools. Maybe there are a few more humanities requirements, and maybe you have to have a little bit more money or an ancestor that went there to get there. But in terms of their pedagogy, their philosophy of education, they're all going to be doing basically the same thing, which, as you pointed out, is a pretty pragmatic approach to education. Let's get people ready for the job market. And that really is the end of the whole enterprise. And that end then drives the means. So you develop programs that can funnel people into those jobs. And then you can pad your stats and show your high average starting salaries, and all the companies that recruit your students differentiate between that and what we do at New College. One of the reasons that I hesitate on this question is because, on the one hand, I want to say absolutely yes, it can. But then on the other hand, I want to say it should and it may, but at times in reality, it may not. So we want to say things like, yes, we focus on virtue and the whole person at New College. But ultimately, that is the most pragmatic thing. Our graduates can do X, Y, and Z. And then we end up basically falling back into the same error and saying this same end goal, the same definition of success post-graduation is really what's motivating us, right? So we're doing these things, and these things are better, but we're really a lot of times making the argument these things are better for the same reasons that you all do all those other things, go to state school or go to an Ivy League or whatever. So an example is I went to grad school at St. John's College in Annapolis. And a few years ago, one of the graduates there had a piece in the New York Times that was effectively making this argument, saying, we create lifelong learners who can pick up anything, ... And here are the stats to prove it. High salaries, blah, 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 blah.
Yeah, I've seen that about homeschooling before.
Yeah. And I think the problem with this argument is that we're accepting the terms of success that the world has already laid out for us. And it takes it as given that the outcome, which is defined for us by the world, equals success. So if I can argue that studying Plato and Aristotle is ultimately going to make more successful engineers and business leaders or whatever, I'm still really just a utilitarian. And the second that some other method proves more successful, then I should switch from Plato and Aristotle and do that other thing. So I do believe that it is true that what we're doing is equipping students to go on and pick up literally anything that they want to do. I think that's the principal educational virtue of, in terms of skills of what we're doing, is that it equips people to pick up anything that they would want to learn because they come at it from a first principles approach and can solve problems. But what I also want to say is that I want the world to be the kind of place where the character and the virtue that our students have and the skills that they're equipped with give them some measure of what most of us think of as success. But wanting the world to be such a place is a very different thing from wanting our students to have worldly success, no matter what sort of place the world is.
Right.
So even if my answer is yes, right now, they can support a family. Like, what if next year we find ourselves in the, in the time of the Diocletian persecution of Christians? I think the answer would have to be no. Right. We're actually serving up lambs to the slaughter in a way. So anyway, I think that's important to say that, because I do think it's true that the way that we do things is the best way to equip students to go out in the world and live virtuous lives and be diligent and skillful at everything that they put their hand to. But I also think that it's important that we say at some points that may not be appreciated. I mean, this skill will be appreciated, but you may have, even today, people are in situations where they basically have to muzzle themselves at work in order to.
Yep.
And so in some eras of history, your wisdom and virtue and your godliness causes you to stand before kings. In other areas, it causes the kings to chop your head off.
Right.
we are still pursuing, ultimately we're pursuing with the same end, and that is the worship of the one true God.
Mm.
So I know that's not maybe the most direct answer to the question, and I can get more into, and I will, I'll get into more specific.
I think it was really helpful because I feel like next time somebody around here asks me why they have to learn this, I'm just going to tell them because you will be a more interesting roommate at the re-education camps.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think
Perfect. I
that
love
might
it.
really be helpful. So, no, we would love to hear more. Whatever you want to tell us.
Okay. Yeah. So, I mean, just some specific examples from new college. I mean, we've got grads in seminaries and grad schools. We've got entrepreneurs that have started marketing businesses. We've got a guy who's creating handcrafted bespoke eyeglasses, and his clients fly him all over the world just to do personal fittings.
Wow.
And I would also I definitely don't want to toot my own horn, but just to talk about my own experience a little bit, because it might be helpful.
I think it is actually. I mean, I read your bio and I thought that's one of the reasons why I thought you'd be perfect was because you actually do have that background and you have a business background.
Yeah. So I mean, I got to University of Tennessee, Knoxville, and I went there to study jazz guitar. I was going to be a guitarist.
Oh, wow.
And discovered St. John's while I was a freshman and applied, and ended up not being able to go for various reasons. But I looked at what they were doing and I said, I'm going to now use my college education to start my own classical education.
Hmm.
So I became a classics major and majored in Greek, minored in Latin, and, super impractical. And I got one of those questions. What in the world are you going to do with that? I remember going to one of my advisors and saying, what about a PhD? Should I do a PhD? And he looked at me, and in his peculiar way, he just said, there are no jobs.
Hmm.
But anyway, so I graduated from UT and then went to St. John's for grad school, which was basically just a continuation of my own efforts to get myself an education. And I taught for a few years. So I taught at the high school level, and that's a fairly logical thing to do with a degree like that.
Mm-hmm.
But I also came to the realization around my third year of teaching that I really was intrigued by economics and the market and business, and I really wanted to try my hand at that. And so that my third year of teaching, in addition to all my teaching duties, I just taught myself a whole bunch of stuff. I basically gave myself an MBA level of finance in that year as teaching Latin and math and music to high schoolers, and was able to do that. And again, it's not tooting my own horn. It's just, I think I had been fortunate, even though I didn't get the strict liberal arts education that we're talking about. I did get the perspective that, all knowledge is connected in the Logos, and all truth flows from him. All truth flows back to him. I felt well equipped to understand anything that I put my mind to. And so I did that. And I was able to get a job in equity research in a finance firm out of my third year of teaching. And that was, it was trying. It was difficult because everybody looked at my background, and, I got lots of rejections, of course, because they said, why in the world you didn't take any finance or accounting courses? I took one economics course in college, and I think I got a C in it. I don't remember anything from it. But anyway, I was fortunate enough to get a guy who, found it interesting and gave me a shot. And so I was able to do that for a couple of years. And then ultimately I did decide to go back and do a business degree. And that was a very utilitarian degree on my part. At that point, I was already older than the average bear, older than the average MBA student, had a couple of kids, and was just looking to kind of boost the career path a little bit. But there again, I came in and tested out of basically all of the core finance and statistics classes because I had just taught myself. Again, that's the virtue, I think, of a liberal arts style education, is that you do have the tools to do that. You're not just, a computer to have somebody write some code on that equips you to do one particular thing. And I went on from there and have had a career in healthcare and finance and run companies. And It's possible. It is definitely possible to do well with a liberal arts degree.
It connects to what you pointed out at the very beginning, too, that, students who have a college degree make more money. So let's just get everyone college degrees, as if it's the college degree when it might just have been the person.
Right.
And like, does the person have initiative and ideas?
Yeah, I do think that is important.
And listening to your description of your story, I was thinking something kind of similar to Misty. I was thinking just even in terms of just work ethic, willingness to do what it took. You read the books that you needed to read in order to get that first job or whatever. Because I mean, I have met the unemployed PhD types from time to time. And a lot of the ones that I have met, they tend to seem just not very driven.
Mm-hmm.
They want an academic job sometimes because they don't want to be out in the working world. Like there's an attraction, which I can sympathize with because I loved grad school. I loved living in that bubble where everything was really this comfortable world for me. Just academic and talking about important things all of the time. And I didn't have to deal with, I don't know, the outside world so much. So I wonder how much of it too is really, I guess, combination character, work ethic, that kind of thing. I'm just thinking because I was on staff at a university like 25 years ago. And while I was there, we were lowering our standards in order to open the school up to more people.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a Christian university. So we were even dumbing down the theology classes because we had people coming in who, I mean, they weren't raised in the church. I have sympathy for it. They didn't grow up on Bible stories. They didn't have the foundational knowledge that the average student used to have when they were coming in. And coupling that with just a lot of evangelical churches quit teaching any history or even Old Testament. I mean, there were good reasons why they were doing that, but ultimately they were lowering the standards. And as they were doing that, and then they're doing studies on their graduates, they were seeing the income drop of their average graduate.
Mm-hmm.
And I just wonder if those two things are connected. In trying to be all things to everyone, they actually weren't able to have the same quality of graduate that they had when they were a smaller school.
Yeah, I think that plays a really important part. Hugh of Saint Victor and the Didascalion and the very end, the introduction to that, he talks about, he basically says there's two kinds of people. He kind of constructs a 2x2 matrix of people that have ability and people that don't have ability, and then people that work hard and people that don't work hard. So you've got, people with ability that work hard, people with ability that don't work hard, people without ability that work hard, people without ability that don't work hard. And I mean, he's talking specifically about intellectual virtues there, but I think that's really important. And it's really important as people are thinking about, whether or not college is for them. I mean, this is a really difficult question to grapple with, just as confused as the whole higher education landscape is. But I do think it's important to consider one's own, just what one wants to do. I mean, I think ability, the intersection of ability, opportunity, and desire, all of those things are important. And so if you've got the ability and the opportunity and the desire to pursue something like a liberal arts education, then that speaks well of the diligence that you talked about that you're going to display in the future. I mean, diligence might be one of the key virtues that it is required to get through a program like that, and also that a program like that can teach you, because it is difficult, it is arduous. You do have to have thick skin. You have to be able and willing to disagree with peers and be disagreed with, and not have your feelings hurt or need a safe space to flee to. That is really important when you come into a place in the world where you have no choice but to just go out and find whatever grinding job you can find because you have a family to support, or when you're in a big, safe, but important job and you need to do it well and do it with excellence. At New College, there's two of those quadrants I think are good for us, the Hugh of St. Victor the lower ability, but high motivation, and of course high ability and high motivation.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I think there's a ton to be said for that motivation part. Yes, you need a baseline kind of level of ability just to get through the material. But somebody who is maybe not as sharp as their classmate, but just as driven, can do just as well. A story that I always think of, one of my favorite moments as a teacher was in my second year teaching Latin. I had a student who was just abysmal. I mean, she was horrible at Latin, but she worked her tail off and ended up with maybe like the lowest C you could possibly get. But it was one of my proudest moments. And, you know, her mom gave me a hug when the year was over, and it was just, and she was so satisfied with herself for the work that she had put in to get through that. And, you know, contrast that to one of my Latin 2 students who was brilliant and hardly had to do anything to get A's. And he's, you know, he didn't do so well after school, just morally, emotionally, all that stuff. We want to be the kind of place at New College where we're welcoming to those that are driven and diligent. And really what that amounts to, I think, is good stewardship of what God has given you.
You remind me of a guy I knew in grad school, and he ended up going on to take one of, I think Notre Dame only opens up 2 spots for a PhD in philosophy every year. It's very hard to get in. And he ended up getting one of those. But I remember in talking with him, he was talking about how he was pretty sure he was the least intelligent person in his class, in his program, I mean. And I remember him saying, but I work harder than everybody. And that's what ended up making a difference. I mean, he got one of the most coveted spots, and I really do think it was his hard work. I didn't think about that in connection with this, but come to think of it, what made the difference ultimately? I mean, I think it's because eventually everybody hits a wall, right? Regardless of how smart you are, or how quick of a study you are, eventually you're going to hit that place where you have to actually work. And I think those of us who never hit that place at critical younger ages find it hard to step it up all of a sudden. You know, like when you're 25 and you've never done anything hard, it's hard to find those internal resources to now start doing the hard things.
Yeah.
And to recognize that hitting that wall is actually good for you.
Yeah,
Right.
true.
That goes back to Thomas à Kempis. Those trials, those struggles are blessings from God.
Well, I would like to know if there is a difference between, you know, there's a number of these smaller, newer liberal arts colleges popping up. So we've got New St. Andrews and New College Franklin, and there was one, I can't remember what it was called. There was a Catholic one that was by our old house in California within a couple hours from there. And so, I mean, it seems like there's more and more of them starting. Is there a difference between these types of colleges and being a classics major at a bigger university? Like, does it produce a different type of graduate, or I don't know, I guess I'll just leave it there. Is there a difference? And if so, what is it?
Yeah. Yes, for sure. Again, I'll hesitate a little bit with the general smaller liberal arts colleges, but maybe we can distinguish between them later on. So I'll just stick with classics major at a major university versus, I don't know, New College and New St. Andrews and similar.
Okay.
So yeah, there's a big difference. So a classics major, you're going to be doing a lot of intensive language study and translation. You may not get trained on a lot of research techniques at the undergrad level, but some definitely learn how to look for and cite secondary sources. You're going to be focused almost entirely on Mediterranean cultures from, 1,000 years before Christ to a couple hundred years after at the most. And the pedagogy is still going to be similar to what's going on in the rest of the college. So you're typically not going to learn Greek mythology by reading a lot of original texts and discussing them with your classmates. It's more likely you're going to have a big textbook, and it's probably co-authored by your instructor and costs $100. You have a new edition every year because, that 10th edition was so last year. And that's got It's got compiled information on the Olympians from a bunch of different sources, and you do the readings, and then you go sit in a lecture hall and listen to the professor talk about it for an hour. Maybe if you're lucky, you're reading a couple of original sources. Maybe if you're really lucky, they break you off into small groups and you get to talk about it a little bit. Even in the classics program at UT was pretty small. There was actually one semester where I was the only Greek major in a school of like 25,000 students.
Oh, wow.
So I had classes that were literally just me and the professor. But I read Plato and we didn't talk about forms. I read Lysias and we didn't talk about the Athenian justice system. I read Homer and we didn't talk about courage or man's desire to know.
Oh, wow.
They were largely translation exercises. And don't get me wrong, it was great. I got really excellent language training, but definitely a difference. And maybe you're thinking of something else when you say a classics program, but when I'm thinking of a classics program, I'm thinking, Greek, Latin, ancient history.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, that was what I was thinking.
Yeah. But yeah, you really get a classics major because you want to go on and do graduate research in the classics for the most part. And that's kind of it. And that's probably why I was the only Greek major in the school, because there aren't that many people that want to do that. And as my advisor noted, there are no jobs.
Right. So then New College Franklin is, I know a lot of what you do because I hear about it from my students, but for our listeners. So, I'm assuming some of the texts that you named are even being read by students at New College. So then what's the difference? I guess it's not a translation exercise.
Right. Yeah. So a big difference. Yeah, that's a huge difference. They're going to be reading most of these texts in New College in translation. They'll be reading them in English. The Greek that we do there is Koine Greek. So they will be engaging with the New Testament in the original language. And, a big part of that is, and just has to be when you're learning a language, it just has to be, pretty mechanical instruction and just learning how to grapple with the language. So, your first semester, even your second semester, you're probably not doing really in-depth, thoughtful exegesis because you're just acquiring the tools to do that in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
You have to do some of that legwork. Third semester, they're definitely doing more of that. But then as to the other works, as to Homer and Plato, they don't get to read them in the original, but they get a lot more out of them than I got in my classics program, because they're engaging with the ideas and they're sitting in class for an hour to 2 hours talking about them. And then when class ends, they walk out into the halls and they keep talking about it.
Mm-hmm.
It's definitely much more philosophical. So, maybe let's compare it to a philosophy program at a major college. Even there, I would say that it's going to look fairly similar to what I described for classics without the language component. So it's almost always going to be lecture. You're almost always going to be reading a textbook that tells you what these thinkers thought and, what kind of ism they adhered to.
Mm-hmm.
And you're going to regurgitate it on a test. Even if they do insert some kind of discussion component, there is not the same emphasis on, we need to grapple with these important questions they are asking and talk through them together and argue about them. It's a very unique approach. St. John's is another one I would put in that category as doing that well. They do a good job of having you dive into texts and discuss them. Albeit without the recognition that the logos is overall.
Why is the discussion component? I feel like you keep bringing that back up. Lecture versus discussion. Why is that a critical difference?
Well, just to put it really plainly, there's a difference between learning things hands-on and learning things from somebody telling you what to do. Getting into a car engine and taking it apart and trying to keep track of all of the different bolts and things and where they go is a very different way of learning, and arguably one where you're going to learn the engine better than if you just have a manual that tells you to take everything apart and where to put it back together. One of the ways that that's probably going to be more effective is you're probably going to make more errors in the first way without the instruction manual. But in making those errors, you experience pain, the pain of the engine not working, which makes the right way to do it stick that much better. So, I guess it's kind of analogous to that. Not that with some of these things, there's a really solid, yes, this is the correct answer of what Plato is saying here. But I think the exercise of going through a text together with multiple people that are all reading the same thing and are all reading other things as well, and for whom different things in the text stick out, either as more or less important, can really help you, see things that you didn't see before, understand a writer in a way that you didn't understand him when you first read him. And then, just grappling with fundamental truths, ultimate truths. Who is God? Who are we? What is justice? What is virtue? All of these things, they're really not simple questions. They're really complicated questions. I think part of what we do is just very simply recognizing that some of the most basic questions are incredibly difficult and have been grappled with for millennia by our fellow fallen human beings. And going back to the being disgruntled with traditional higher education, I think part of why people are disgruntled is because they don't grapple with these things. These questions are, at best inconvenient, at worst they're taboo. They get in the way of our vocational training at best, and at worst they, teach us that there's a God and makes us Christian nationalists or whatever. Honestly, a big part of it is just the recognition that these questions are so difficult and have been grappled with for so long, and they're really important. What could possibly be more important than whether or not we have a never dying soul, and whether or not there's a God who will call us to account? And how could I be satisfied saying, I'm just not gonna deal with those questions because I just need my high income and my hobbies and whatever it is, and that's it. The other things show me that there is something more that I need to be worried about, and that's a burden. Again, going back to Kempis, woe to those who know not their own misery, and greater woe to those who love this miserable and corruptible life. I don't know if that really answers the question. One other thing that I was thinking about with respect to lecture versus discussion, and I haven't thought through this a ton, but I wonder if some of our emphasis on lecture goes hand in hand with kind of post-Enlightenment thought, materialism, and man being more or less a computer. Our brains are processors of information. And the end of all of that processing is the manipulation of the world around us for our ends, which is, success, like we've been talking about, high income, or technically manipulating things to do certain things. And so if that's the case, then really we just need information, downloaded matrix style into our brains to affect those things, to successfully manipulate the world around us. But if that's not the case, if we're not just matter, if the end of education is not just material gain or manipulation of the world around us, if the end of our education is the worship of the true and living God, it requires something more than just the download of information. I think about being in heaven with an infinite God whose beauty and love is inexhaustible. We're not going to get to heaven and have God's being downloaded into our brains and know it all. We're going to spend eternity in the process of learning of him and exploring who he is and enjoying his love and returning his love. It seems there's something of the infinite in the nature of learning itself. And if it's infinite, then that implies a kind of process and not just this perfunctory downloading of information.
Now you're making me think about the difference between classics major and liberal arts college as partly being not just discussion, but the actual studying of the 7 liberal arts. So I'm thinking, I don't know. I remember Misty and I read the Didascalicon, I don't know, was it 3 years ago, Misty, I think now?
Yeah, something like that.
And I remember by the time I got to the end, feeling like, well, I can never be I could never be well educated because I feel like at this point in my life, covering all 7 liberal arts is kind of out of my league. I'm not sure that's really true, but that was how I felt by the end. I was kind of despairing.
Mhm.
I think the Didascalicon makes a good case that you need the 7 liberal arts in order to be, well, they're not calling it classical education because it's an old book, but in order to be well educated. I mean, I'm almost wondering if there's a difference between having been classically educated and being a classics major. Like, are classics majors classically educated? Does
No.
that question make sense?
Yeah. I don't, if I understand you correctly, no, I don't think so. Again, I think a classics major in a traditional university, a quote unquote traditional university, it's just another silo. So the subjects are all siloed off. You've got your sociology and psychology and classics and philosophy and engineering and pre-med and all these things. And never the twain shall meet. So a classics major in a traditional college is kind of another vertical of knowledge. And I would say the main thing about a classical education is precisely the elimination. Elimination may be too strong a word, but certainly I'll just say elimination of those silos. I don't think that, some taxonomy is not warranted. I think it is. It's helpful to
Right.
put things in categories and think that way. But, a proper taxonomy, leads up to its highest like category. And even in the division of things, we ought to be able to go back and see the connections between all of them and how they all flow from similar points and point back to that same point, and thus how they have things in common and relate to one another. And that's what I think a true classical education ought to do well, is to teach people to see those connections and understand how things are related.
That's interesting because something I've been thinking about lately is within classical homeschooling, with obviously students younger than college, we talk a lot about goodness, truth, and beauty. And one thing I've been thinking about lately is how we've forgotten that unity is also transcendental.
Hmm.
So, this idea that there is a unifier, I mean, ultimately the unifier would be Christ, but that there is a reality that unites all these different things. I guess I'm listening to you and I'm thinking, so really the existence of a classics major is just another symptom of the fragmentation of knowledge that comes from the rejection of unity as a transcendental, I think.
Hmm. Yeah, I think that's interesting. I think that's right. Where I want to stop short is I don't want to say that all specialization is bad,
True.
right?
Yeah.
I'm glad that there are people that have specialized in all of these different things. And there's been plenty of good that's come out of that. But I don't know. It's an open question to me. I do wonder if whatever technological or intellectual gains that we might have gotten from specialization, I do wonder sometimes if the trade-off was worth it. Creating incredible surgeons who have no idea why they're being surgeons or what a human is. I mean, probably it is. I don't know. That's a really tough question.
I feel like Michael Crichton would say no. I was thinking about early America and, reading one time that, for example, going into something like Harvard, back when Harvard was new, people came in, they already knew Latin, they already knew Greek. and how rare that is. But it feels to me like the ideal long term when we think about, well, what do these colleges all look like in, say, 30 years? And we've gone through, 2 full generations of trying to make this sort of education a priority from the time children are small. Then it seems like you actually could unify the two. So, like, for example, the ability to do exactly what you're talking about at New College, but in the original tongue. Which, because I mean, really, the specialization, as much as I sounded like I'm knocking the specialization, you couldn't do what you're doing at New College if somebody hadn't have translated it. Right. When you get really into things, it's not even all one language. So it's not like you could just study one language and read all of those. There's multiple languages you would need to know. But I'm wondering if, long term, then you have that, then you get both worlds. You get some of the translation exercises, but you also get the discussion, but you also get to remove the translator from the equation. So you're reading, I know some people think it's more of a pure thought if you're reading it in the original. I don't know. I'm just thinking long term, maybe that's something that everything will coalesce into as all of us are working together to try to recover classical education.
Yeah, I mean, you're speaking my love language. I would love to someday in the future have Latin and Greek as prereqs for, even coming in. I think we're a long way from that right now, but
right, for sure.
Yeah, well, time is, I don't know, things can change quickly. Yeah, could we be there in 30 years? Why not? Could we be there in 18 years with the current students? I mean, it only takes one generation of people to do that.
I feel like those kinds of things are possible in the sense that I think about how, like Misty, your kids, my kids, the starting place that they have when they start homeschooling is different from what we had.
Yes.
So, even though I will say, for example, my son that's at your school, Andy, he's forgotten most of his Latin, I'm sure, just from not being able to keep it up while he's been gone. But starting from having forgotten a lot of your Latin is very different from where I started, which was, I didn't even know what an inflected language was. I had never heard of it until we hit 4th grade and my list said start Latin.
Yeah.
And so it's just a very, it's a very different starting place. And so when we think about the recovery of knowledge, just not having to find out what an inflected language is a huge step up from where we were. And then, moving forward, I just think, well, then, then if their kids stay diligent, well, they also have a different starting place. And so it doesn't take, I mean, I don't think we have to have actually that many shoulders to stand on before we get to where we're in a pretty good place. It just requires everyone to not drop the ball, which might be asking a lot.
Yeah, I agree with that. I do wonder sometimes about the universal, or I should just say how widely applicable that should be as a goal. Because yes, it would be great to be the kind of place where students came in knowing Latin and Greek. I don't know that everybody necessarily should aspire to that, right?
True. That's true.
Even all homeschoolers. I think they're wonderful. I think they add a lot to, even if you're not going to go on, I think knowing some Latin and understanding language is incredibly helpful. But no, in general, I agree. I think it could definitely get there. And I don't think I don't think it would have to be that far off, but it would have to start. There'd have to be a coordination of pushing and pulling, the pulling coming from the universities demanding it and the pushing coming from the lower schools teaching it. But I mean, I think also really important in this whole discussion is back to your point about what is classical education. Yeah, the resources today so looking at the K through 12 level, resources today are vastly different than they were 20 years ago. My mom, I was an experimental homeschool child back in the 90s. And my mom was just, making it up. You were really, really weird if you homeschooled, and we were weird.
Misty was too.
Yep.
Did you have a big van?
Oh yeah, 15 passenger. That's what I learned to drive on.
Yeah. We
Oh.
only had the 12 passenger, but yeah, that was fun. But yeah, so then you had the kind of, I don't know if it's a resurgence or just a surgence of classical education in the 90s, led a lot by Doug Wilson and Recovering the Lost Tools of Learning, and which I think was amazing. But then what I think you saw was it's difficult to apply, right? Because nobody really knew what it looked like in practice because nobody was doing it. So everybody was kind of figuring it out on the fly. I think you ended up with a lot of schools that said, oh, okay, so I can add a logic class and a Latin class and a Bible class, and now I'm a classical school.
Yep. It's exactly.
I taught at one of those schools once. The subjects are still siloed. The connections aren't being made. The goals of, we want our students to go to these schools, we're all the same. And so, I think we'd have to be careful about that too now at the higher education level, because there are more schools like NCF and NSA popping up. And I hope that we're circumspect as people are thinking about it and doing it, and not just saying, remember the good old days when we still had God in school and when we read some great books. So let's do a great books program and Bible class.
Yeah,
but
call it good.
Yeah, exactly. And then I think back to your very first question about employment, you run the risk of doing a real disservice and giving people the worst of both worlds. So you neither get a good vocational degree, nor do you really get a good classical degree that equips you to go and figure out whatever you want to put your hands to. And you just have debt and a school that nobody's ever heard of.
On that note, I appreciate your caution, actually, because I think that's something that I don't know that I've ever heard really talked about as far as, evaluating these schools or thinking through. I mean, it's just, how it is. You've got these children that you've been homeschooling and home educating, and you're trying to do classical education with them at home. And then that becomes the question, once they're in 10th grade or so, well, what comes next? What are the options? So I think this has been a really helpful conversation in terms of people getting some of their questions answered, even about those kinds of options. I know, I'll have to tell you, I have one of my other children that's at home. I just kept kind of pushing her towards New College Franklin because I feel like she has it in her to do it. And she finally turned to me and said, "Mom, I don't want to talk about philosophy all the time." And I had thought that perhaps her resistance had been because, she didn't want to do that level of work, was what I was afraid of, that she was just avoiding it because she was scared that maybe she couldn't cut it or whatever. And when I heard her say that, I thought, okay, that was probably the best reason I've ever heard for not applying. Because that definitely showed me that she was not at a place in her life where that would have been a good fit for her. Not that I wasn't sad.
Makes me sad to not get another Venzel. But
well, who knows? There's still one more in the pool that maybe he's a little young to decide. So you never know.
Yeah.
In fact, he'll be there in May. You might get to meet him. So anyway, but with that, I feel like Misty and I both think these new small liberal arts colleges are so important because it gives these kids to kind of get this capstone of the education we've been trying to give them.
Mm-hmm. And make it their own.
Yeah.
Apart.
Yeah. Completely apart away from mom.
Yes.
Having to stand on their own feet in terms of their own diligence and their own, even just the study skills part of it, right? Like learning to manage their schedules while living away from their parents and all of those kinds of things. I mean, I know both of us have seen our boys grow up so much. And I mean, I know living away from home and going to college does that some of it's just moving out, right? But I feel like it's more than that, just the depth of the conversations that we get to have with them.
And that they're having with one another too, which I think comes from that discussion-based learning, and that the discussion started in the class, but then it continues out. Like, if I go down to the downtown coffee shop here in Moscow, like you can tell what class is reading what, because like just the hum of conversation is happening in the off hours. Or, we have students over for dinner, and there is no lack of very interesting conversation no matter where we go. And that's just a testimony that, waking up their minds and that they're thinking and they're relating what they know to life.
Yeah.
And becoming interesting people. So then you add that to someone who has interests or connections or whatever, and a willingness to work. And you don't really have to be afraid that they're not going to make a living out in the world. Like, I don't know. I don't have that much sympathy for fears there anymore. Just like, well, have you seen how hard it is for people to get good employees? Like, if your kid shows up on time and can speak in complete sentences, like, he's already ahead. So
I mean, that's true.
I'm not really worried on that front.
Yes. My daughter's boss just fired someone for that reason yesterday. So, but I'm thinking also, for me at least, I sent my son away to a place where he came back. He's coming back a better human.
Yeah.
I mean, technically he's not coming back at all because he's ditching me for a girl, but still.
Which is also what you want to see.
Which is also what I wanted. Exactly. And a lovely girl at that. But I'm just thinking, because I have seen so many parents send their precious homeschool children away, and 3 to 4 years later, they are completely heartbroken and devastated by the damage that school has done to that child. And I don't want to entirely place the blame on the child, because I know there's a lot of different factors, but being immersed at very critical ages, very easily influenced ages, in a culture that hates God and tells them that the ultimate wisdom for them is to embrace foolishness. And the parents have poured all of this money into this school that caused their child to walk away from everything they were taught. I mean, to me, it's a comfort that these schools exist, that schools like New College and New St. Andrews exist, and that they're there to encourage our kids not to avoid these hard, difficult questions, and yet doing it still under the Lord's authority and under Scripture's authority.
Yeah.
We've been at this a long time. Misty, is there anything else you want to ask?
No, this has been a good conversation.
Well, Andy, we appreciate you coming here today and answering all these questions. It's been so helpful.
I have really enjoyed it. I appreciate you having me. And I have all kinds of questions that I want to ask you guys, but that's for a different.
Well, if you start a podcast, well, come on. Just kidding.
Deal.
That's it for today. Thank you so much for listening and being a part of the sisterhood of the podcast. Please make sure you are following us in your favorite podcast player so that you don't miss any of our upcoming episodes. If you enjoyed today's episode, share it with a friend and then discuss it with her. This is a great way to continue the conversation. All of the books and things we mentioned today are linked in our show notes. Just go to scolesisters.com/SS139 to check it out. Don't forget to register for our spring training sessions with Andrew Schwerneman on teaching history classically. He is truly a master teacher, and you are going to love this training. If you are a Sophie member of the Sistership, these sessions are included for you free of charge. If you are not a Sophie member, head on over to scolesisters.com/history and register. That's scolesisters.com/history. In our next episode, Misty, Abby, and I revisit the topic of rewards and consequences, motivation, and manipulation. You are going to love this one. Until then, we want to remind you once again that homeschooling is a marathon you needn't run alone, so open up your eyes and look around you. Find your sisters. Oh, I can hear you now.
But can you?
Something changed.
Okay, I just wiggled the cord of my microphone.
Oh, how funny. Yeah, no, I totally couldn't hear you before, and now it's fine. We wanted someone from an actual classical college to weigh in on some of the things we're seeing. So why not choose the best one?
That's right.
That was totally aimed at Misty because her child goes to New St. Andrews. We have a little friendly rivalry here.
I don't think so. I mean, this is my first time doing one of these, so you might have to do a lot of editing.
Well, usually we just edit out when I put my foot in my mouth, but we could do whatever you need.